So thanks for setting up today's session, and also thanks to those of you online that are taking the time to attend also. It's probably been a while since we've done outreach sessions, so forgive us for any rustiness. I dare say that we've probably not done a practical session like this for our users and stakeholders, since before the days of COVID. But what we aim to do today is leave all of you more informed, better prepared, and to simplify what regulated lobbying is and what you need to be doing in a practical sense. So, in a nutshell, ensuring you're submitting when you need to, and when doing so, submitting what is relevant. And supplementary to that, we hope to use those of you in the call today as guinea pigs on a new message that we're trying to promote, and which we do hope is a practical assistance to you as users, but there'll be more to follow on that later. So we've got an hour for the session, and we want to ensure we leave enough time for some Q&A. And between Fiona and I, we'll try to cover a good bit of ground here between now and the end. So I'm going to lead off with a brief introduction to the Act and what regulated lobbying is. And then Fiona's got to go into a little bit more detail on your reporting responsibilities. And then I'll come back in and wrap up with some good practice on compliance. So if you can move on to the next slide, please, Esther. So yeah, it may be the case that some of you in attendance today are not fully familiar with the Act, and you may only now be hearing about it and considering whether your organisation might need to register. So we can go over some of the details of that in the coming slide, but just for now, a very sort of quick trip back in time. The origins of the Lobbying Scotland Act 2016, as we have here, it really stemmed from the fact that it was an opposition MSP, Labour's Neil Finlay, that was working on a proposal to bring a members' bill on lobbying back in session 4. Now, the Scottish Government, as was its right, stepped in and said that it would bring forward a bill on the subject. So towards the end of session 4, the bill, or the Act as we have now, that we have today, was passed. And unusually for a Scottish Government bill, in fact, it might not have ever happened before or since, the responsibility for its administration was passed to the Scottish Parliament. So a small team, basically Billy McLaren, the lobbying registrar, and myself, was then put together to bring the Act to life and have it commenced. So through the development of the Lobbying Register website, to writing guidance, and then going around likely stakeholders to promote it. Some of you might have been in some of those meetings way back when. We were then in a place to go live back in 12th of March 2018. So we're now 6 years down the line, and just some very quick facts and figures for you. We've got over 1,300 organisations now registered with us. That's probably growing all the time as well. And there are over 35,000 information returns that are published, which breaks down to roughly 28,000 instances of substantive lobbying and 7,000 nil return declarations made by organisations. And bearing in mind those numbers, it's also probably worth saying that we're currently now a team of 6 rather than just a team of 2. Such has been the volume. But it's worth emphasising that first and foremost, why we're here, and the Lobbying Register is a transparency initiative. Its existence is not because of any scandal in relation to any lobbying in Scotland. I know sometimes lobbying has a bit of a negative connotation and cash for questions, etc. But it was introduced because something that we've always been very keen to highlight, that it's not a negative activity, lobbying, and we're very much of the view that lobbying is a fundamental need and right for any organisation to raise its issues and ideas. If you can move the next slide, please, Esther. So I just wanted to put this one in briefly, and I've already used it a couple of times, the phrase regulated lobbying. It's what you hear us talking about, as I mentioned, and very much what you'd read in correspondence from us. So I just thought it useful to highlight this and lead on to explaining a bit more what regulated lobbying is. So if you're okay to move on to the next one again, Esther. Thank you. So this is kind of going into what regulated lobbying is, and what we have here is the 5 key steps flowchart. An illustration which hopefully would be familiar to some of you in the room today, but we always work to the assumption that someone has never seen this before. So this 5 key steps flowchart really underpins what regulated lobbying is and what organisations need to consider. We came up with this in the very early days when when we're trying to help organisations decide whether they need to register, and obviously we still use this to the day. We find this a useful tool. And hopefully what you can see on the screen, the information provided is self-explanatory, but I'll just go over each step just to provide some supplementary information. So you see here, step 1 talks about communicating orally and face-to-face. So to confirm, that's no written communications, no phone calls, no direct messages, tweets, etc. Step 2 talks about communicating about the Scottish Government or parliamentary functions. And if you were to read the Act, Section 2 would set out a bit more about this. But what we're talking about here is like legislation, Scottish Government or policies, the provision of grants, licences, lodging of parliamentary questions and motions, and probably matters that you'd expect your MSP to be interested in and being aware of as a representative of the Scottish Parliament. Step 3, this is about engaging with the individuals that are covered at step 1 in relation to speaking on behalf of the organisation that you are representing. So just to be clear, it's not about matters that you would raise in a personal capacity. And step 4, and I expect this would maybe be quite pertinent to maybe the audience today as well, regulated lobbying only covers communications that are made when you are paid to represent the organisation that you're speaking on behalf of. So basically doing your job. And as I say, maybe being pertinent, I'm maybe making an assumption here, but when it comes to third sector organisations, it may be the case that a lot of your engagement or lobbying is carried out by volunteers and maybe even some of your service users. And step 5, the final one, I just wanted to draw attention to the fact that there are exemptions in the Act, which are set out in the parliamentary guidance. But if we could move on to the next slide, Esther, I'll kind of show the table of these exemptions. So I'm not going to go over all of these in any great detail today, but they are useful to be included, especially if maybe we share the presentation or recording after today with you all. So definitely happy to take any questions on any of these if anybody wants to ask anything directly about these. But before we do move on, again, I think it's probably useful to draw your attention both to what I mentioned at step 4 regarding the paid element to regulated lobbying. Obviously, that's in there in this table. And again, potentially useful for today as well, is I think it's worth highlighting the small organisations exemption. That's for organisations with less than 10 full-time equivalent employees. And I thought, again, third sector organisations, that might be particularly relevant. But again, happy to discuss further. What I'll do now is, if we can move on to the next slide, please, Esther, and I'll hand over to Fiona.
Great, thanks James, good afternoon everyone. Thanks Esther. So I'm going to take you through some of the reporting requirements, and following that I'm going to give you a look at the registrant's dashboard that's on the lobbying register. So your statutory periods, they're based on 6 monthly reporting, and the start date of your statutory periods is determined either by when you registered or when you first lobbied, so whichever is the earliest, and these dates will remain fixed, so it's the same reporting cycle of dates each year. Esther, could I get the next slide, please? Okay, so just having a look at compliance here. So in terms of compliance, when you're submitting information returns to the register, you've got up to 6 months plus 2 additional weeks, and that's what we call your grace period, to submit your information returns for any regulated lobbying that you've carried out in that 6-month period. That 2-week grace period that you've got, it just allows you that little bit more time for information returns to be submitted following the end of the 6 months. And this proves particularly useful if you've perhaps had a meeting on the last day of your statutory period. You've then got that 2-week grace period to get a return in rather than just having to rush it through on that very last day. But it's worth flagging that if there's a failure to submit anything for a 6-month period, that is a breach of the Act and it will be recorded as such. Worth noting also that although it's a 6-month period, you can actually submit your information returns at any point during the 6 months. It's ultimately up to an organisation to decide when they want to submit the returns. Some will do it as one batch at the end of the 6 months, but we do have organisations that will submit it as and when they engage in regulated lobbying. We obviously can't tell you when to do it. Like I said, it's up to the organisation, but we would probably encourage you to do it as and when. Reason being, that information is usually going to be fresher in your memory. And say, for example, if you lobby in early in the start of your statutory period, if you're then not submitting it until the end of a statutory period, that could be some 5 or 6 months later, then there's obviously a bit of a time lag in getting that return published onto the register. The next point in this image here, so you'll receive an email to remind you about your 6-month deadlines in advance, and that's going to be usually 2 weeks before your end date, which would be 4 weeks before the end of your grace period, and that's what we refer to as a reminder email. Worth noting though that these reminders are only sent out as a courtesy by the lobbying team. So on that basis, we do encourage organisations to make sure they're aware of their reporting deadlines and not just solely rely on receiving this reminder as the prompt to submit the returns. The next point down there in that image then, so after your 6-month period, if you've not engaged in regulated lobbying, it is still a legal requirement to submit a nil return, just to confirm that you have got no activity for that 6 months. And it also helps to show that your organisation hasn't engaged in regulated lobbying in a particular time frame. The last point in this image, it's more aimed at organisations that aren't yet registered on the lobbying register, but worth noting all the same that if you do engage in regulated lobbying prior to registering an account, you do need to register an account and then submit that information return for that instance of regulated lobbying within 30 days of that occurrence. And I think I'd probably also flag at this point, accounts on the lobbying register are organisational, and it's only one active account per organisation. We do have some individuals that think they need their own personal accounts to submit their own direct lobbying. But this is the reason why we tend to advise using a generic email address as a registered email. Where that's possible, it's not always the case, but if you do use a generic email, that way everyone that needs access to the account can access it easily, and it also means that more than one person will be able to pick up any emails that we send out, because we will only send out correspondence to that registered email address. Could I move on slides, please, Esther? Thanks. Right, so next I'm going to take you on a run through of the dashboard screen. Hopefully that's clear enough for everybody to see. Apologies if not. This is something that we introduced as one of our enhancements to the register last summer, and it was to try and improve the user experience of the lobbying register, to try and set things out a bit clearer for a registrant in terms of viewing what their registered activity is. So this is the screen that you're going to see once you've logged into your account. And it's kind of a one-stop shop for all the information that you need about your organisation's account. So just starting over on the left-hand side of that image then for the dashboard, this is really the key information about your organisation's account. So at the top you'll see it confirms the name of the organisation for who the account belongs to. The bullets that follow there, they just give some confirmation on what the dashboard can be used for. So as it says, you can check for any information returns that need action, and I'm going to cover more on this as we go through the dashboard. You can submit information returns and nil returns. You can check what statutory period you're in. And finally, you can check when you last updated your registration details. The next two buttons you see are straightforward enough. As they say, that's what you're going to use to submit an information return or to submit a nil return. And I'll also be covering more about the information return form itself in a later slide. So just working our way down that left-hand side, you'll notice that all these fields are greyed out. So that means nothing can be edited from here, but it does show you, first of all, the email that you've registered with, which is obviously what you've logged into your account with. Just below that is your true registration date. So like I said before, this will either be the date that you registered, or it will be the date of your first instance of lobbying, if that's what occurred first. Quite a useful addition below that next, it's the confirmation of what statutory period you're in, your current statutory period, and it also gives you the dates for that statutory period also. Below there, we've got the box that shows you the date that you last updated your registration details. And this is something we're encouraging organisations now to do every statutory period, just to ensure that we've got the most recent information for your organisation. There may be changes at some point. For example, you might change your registered address. So if there is anything that you need to change, then we would encourage you to do it as soon as possible. And if you do need to check or change your details, I don't know if you can see that wee sentence at the bottom there, but it does suggest that you go up to the Update Account tab, which is in the menu header at the top of the lobbying register. So staying on the dashboard and just going over to the right-hand side of it now. So this is probably the key part of the dashboard for an organisation. We introduced this traffic light system for information returns just to help make it clearer to an organisation what the status of their returns are. So the first one that you see there, the red box, this is where it's going to show if you've got any returns that require attention. And what this means, if you've submitted a return through to us, we've then reviewed it and determined that it perhaps needs some clarification on the lobbying, we've perhaps got a query on a possible exemption applying, or there's just some other query that we need to get clarification on because it's preventing us from publishing it. So we'll return it to your side of the system, to that folder, and we'll also send you an email to your registered email address setting up the queries that we've got. So it's worth monitoring your registered mailbox quite regularly. The next box now, that's the amber one. So this just gives you confirmation that you have submitted a return to us. This area is just like a holding pen really for the return until the lobbying team have reviewed it. Next, the green box, simply put, it just shows you how many returns you've got published. And the last box there is never submitted. So as the name suggests for that one, if you have any returns in here, it means you've only saved the returns and you've never submitted them through to us. They still remain at your side of the system rather than with us for verification. Just below those boxes there at the bottom of the dashboard, there's also some search functionality that allows you to search on your own returns. So if there's a specific meeting or a specific topic you wanted to look back on, that's the functionality that you could use to do that. Okay, so that covers the dashboard. I'll take you briefly through the information return form. So Esther, could I move on a slide, please? Thank you. So as I said earlier, you can access a new information return form by clicking on the button that's on the dashboard, and this is what the form looks like. It's at least part of the form. I've had to split it onto 2 slides, so bear with me while I talk you through both of those. Working through it, you'll find it's fairly self-explanatory in terms of what you need to add here. First off, the data lobbying, nothing more really needs said there. It's the date that you undertook the lobbying on. The next part is for submission period. So this is another enhancement that we added. You're given a drop down of options and you select the statutory period that the return is for. So it's whatever date the lobbying falls into. It's most likely going to be your current statutory period, but there can be occasions when somebody needs to submit something for a statutory period that's now passed. Role of person lobbied and name of person lobbied. Again, it's straightforward enough. You just select who you've lobbied in what capacity. In terms of the role for person lobbied, you'll be given options of MSP, minister, special advisor, and civil servant. And it's worth noting that the only civil servant that's covered by the Act is the permanent secretary. You'll see the button there for add another lobbied person. So that's an option to add multiple MSPs that you've lobbied, and that's going to come in useful if, for example, you gave a speech at an event or if you've attended a meeting that has multiple members in attendance. And I think maybe at this point it's useful to highlight that if you were to attend an event or if you were to hold an exhibition stand, for example, at a party conference, you would need to submit separate returns for every separate conversation. A common issue that we come across with organisations who have lobbied in this way is that they will list every member in the one return when it should actually be separate returns. But the good news for that is that there's a copy function on the return form, which hopefully makes it a less onerous task for organisations. Just going further down then to the address, this is the address of where the lobbying took place. The only exception here would be if you lobbied via video conferencing. If you did that from your home address, you're going to add private residence address withheld in there. We're not in the habit of publishing people's home addresses. But if you did the video conference from a public address, such as an office, you would just add the full address details of that location instead. Next on the screen here, we've got the description field. And again, this can be an area that causes some confusion. So really all that you need to put into this field is how the communication was carried out. So it could be a meeting, video conference meeting, a speech, or a discussion at an event. And then you would just add the name and ministerial title or the constituency or region of the member that you've lobbied. And that's really all that we're looking for in here. You'll hopefully be able to see that we've got some ghost text in there that we added as another enhancement just to try and guide organisations with the type of information that they need to put in there. Can I have the next slide, please, Esther? Thanks. Right, so you're glad to hear there's not much more from me, just the last part of the information return form. But this is really the main part of the form that we're getting onto. It's kind of the more important section for organisations. Firstly, you've got communication type, and as James said earlier about regulated lobbying, this is either going to be a face-to-face, but that does include video conferencing meetings. Next, down you've got the name of the individual who's carried out the communication, and you should only be adding the names of paid representatives of your organisation that engaged in lobbying. Taking us on to, was the lobbying undertaking on the registrant's own behalf? So the registrant is the organisation. It can sometimes be interpreted as meaning the individual that carried out the lobbying. So sometimes an organisation will erroneously select no in this section. We would generally expect it to remain as yes. We really only see it selected as no if it's a consultant that's lobbying on behalf of a client, but there can be the occasion when an organisation selects no if they were lobbying as part of a coalition, for example. Now the purpose field. So this is really the bit we want organisations to focus on. It's where you detail the lobbying that you've undertaken. So you want to be clear on what you were raising, if you had any asks, and generally what you're looking to inform and influence the member on. I mentioned before about the lobbying team sending returns back with an email asking for more detail in the return. And the main reason for this, it usually comes down to the content that's in the purpose field. Now we can imagine that when an email from us drops into a mailbox, it's possibly met with a big sigh, but it's really not a bad thing. I'll try and put a positive spin on it. We're just trying to help you get your return into the best shape possible so that people can clearly see what you're trying to achieve by doing the lobbying. And I think James is going to be taking you through some key advice in this area. So I'm not going to say too much more about it. I'll just finish up on this form with the last bit there, which is the checkbox. That's just to confirm your registered details are up to date. I've already kind of advised you how to change that if you need to. But on this form specifically, you won't be able to submit your return unless you've checked that box. And that is where I wrap up, and I will pass you back over to James.
Thank you, Fiona. Esther, if we could move on to the next slide, please, and I'll take us through just to the end in the last couple of slides. So compliance, good practice. There are various aspects to good compliance, and none more so than what Fiona has just gone over relating to ensuring that your returns are submitted within deadlines. However, I mean, obviously assuming all is well and you are submitting, then you want to make sure that the information returns get published at the first time of asking. Fiona's just mentioned earlier there about receiving emails from us. We're absolutely aware it can sometimes be an unwanted drain on your time, but we do it because we want the register to be a respected source of information. And of course, it's obviously, it's legislation, and it's important that your organisation complies with the law. So if we could move on to the next slide, please, Esther. And this is the guinea pig part. And the trade-off here is that if we can get the positive uptake of the following message, I'd very much hope that we can reduce the need for needing to send email that raise queries and seek feedback. Essentially, it's a win-win for us as administrators and you as a user. And obviously, as you see here, please very much excuse the very basic imagery here. Graphic design has never got to be my forte, but although lacking in pleasing aesthetic qualities, I think it's probably, to be serious, is the most important practical thing that hopefully you'll take away from today's session. It's our hope here, like this acronym and what it stands for is something that hopefully is memorable and effective and could become second nature in consideration when you're writing information returns. So where it kind of stemmed from is the daily review of returns that are submitted that the team carries out each day, and the standard and quality, to be perfectly honest, can vary from being really good to really bad. So we've always tried to get the message across about quality and not quantity of information provided in the return form. And again, Fiona touched on it, I mean, we've introduced ghost text in the form, and that's also in the purpose field, just to try and assist users to consider what it is that they're inputting. And what we've got to have here is my next attempt at kind of getting users to consider a new way of thinking when you're filling out your information returns. And we've used this sparingly so far in correspondence with registrants so far, because, as I say, I wanted to try and load test it today with a sort of a larger audience, and grateful for any feedback at the end. So Esther, if you could move on to the next slide, please. So this is the frame acronym kind of spelled out here, and hopefully you can see here what it means and how I hope that it can be useful as a kind of almost like an aid memoir when you're filling out a form. And the acronym is pretty self-explanatory on screen, but I'll go over it just now anyway. So it says here, obviously, focus. So write about what your representative said, not the generalities of the engagement. Instantly, the amount that you think you need to write will be reduced. So again, too often the purpose field contains the context of a meeting rather than the content of what was said. And again, kind of almost like a top tip, that context for description, content for purpose. And more importantly, all you need to do is supply in the purpose field the detail of what your representative said. Don't worry about what anybody else who may have been in attendance was saying. It's just about your organisation. That are relevant. So what influencing and informing, what are you doing? Erring on the side of caution, submitting every single conversation should not be a consideration now. So this refers to the fact that we continue to have submissions made that are clearly not regulating lobbying communications. So as well as organisations actually try to submit details of letters that they've written or phone calls made, we see returns which come in which are really of a social, personal, courteous nature. One such example, somebody actually tried to submit an information return where they discussed with an MSP who was next in line for the bathroom that they were using at an event. So we're obviously not going to publish these. So some returns that actually I've referred to the fact that erring on the side of caution. Again, some organisations actually write in the box saying they're erring on the side of caution. So we're trying to get past that. Accurate. Have you listed the correct people? Provided the location of the conversation, the correct date. So the content mirrors the conversation that your organisation had. So the devil's in the detail here. And it's important to check the minor and administrative things here, as I've just listed. When returns are published, the individuals lobbied receive a notification. And for instance, the Scottish Government ministerial private offices are regular correspondence with us in querying dates and locations. So we need to follow that up with organisations to ensure accuracy. And just talking about that, I mean, these are factors in slowing down publication of your information returns. Meaningful. So this is all about transparency. Don't leave the readership guessing or assuming that they know your organisation's position on a matter, or why you're discussing that particular bill or policy. We want the register to be a resource that is accessible for all. Kind of consider it should be possible for the layperson reading the register to be able to take away at least a basic understanding of what an organisation has been lobbying for and what its position is in a certain policy or piece of impending legislation. Here it says explicit. So if you've made an ask, include it. And if no ask, then there's obviously a reason why you've gone to a meeting. Is that with the intention to influence? So this comes down to organisations basing decisions on whether to submit purely on whether an ask has been made. As I mentioned there, meetings don't take place for no reason. And it may be more the case that you're on an awareness raising campaign. So that's informing. Of course, obviously, where an ask is made, it makes it very clear and obvious for us that we can be pretty sure that we can move towards publishing straight away. So always good to have an ask if it is there. And if we move on to the final slide, please, Esther. This is just kind of an additional backup to everything that's just gone before. Again, I kind of see this as something that's more useful for you as users to have hand, almost when completing an information return, or even considering whether one is required to be submitted. And one of the things I was thinking about with this slide yesterday was that the questions and points that are raised here are ones which, in my opinion, are very useful. If you're the person that is at your organisation is responsible for completing an information return, but you might not actually be the person that made the communication at the meeting or the event. So it could have been delegated to you by a chief executive or someone who's been engaging with an MSP, and they want you to submit a return in the register. So you, as a submitter, if you can look at the information that they've provided you, and this is where you would hold it up against the frame, as well as the bullet points that we have here on this slide, I'd hope that you could probably, hopefully, legitimately and productively preempt the need for us to ask the questions we'll ask if it is submitted and lacks details and specifics. So almost you could put that to these kind of questions to your chief exec or whoever it is that passes you the information to submit. So as I said near the start, I wanted this session to have a kind of practical benefit to users of the register. And I think possessing the knowledge of what should be in an information return serves to make the process quicker and easier for you stakeholders. And Fiona's gone over sort of the practical enhancements that we've put to the register over the last year as well. And hopefully what we've done today goes some way to achieving that aim. But at that, I think I'll just bring our remarks to a close. And thank you for your time, and also happy to take any questions and discuss further in the time that we have.